Hey, everyone listening from the Murat Kalaman page. Ready for a deep dive?
Always.
All right, well, today we're going to be looking at AI accountability.
Okay.
Specifically, this report on operationalizing the OECD AI Principle 1.5.
Right.
Sounds a little jargony, but I think it's a pretty important topic.
It really is. At its core, it's about making sure the folks creating AI are held responsible,
Yeah.
making sure that their systems function properly, that they're sticking to those ethical guidelines.
So not just like a vague don't be evil, but like actual rules for AI.
Yeah, exactly. Rules of the road.
Okay, so what's the big picture here? What really stood out to you in this report?
Honestly, the thing that struck me most was just how many different approaches there are. The report actually uses this really cool heat map to show how different countries are like implementing AI accountability, and it's wild. It's like a patchwork quilt.
A patchwork quilt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like you see China with all these super specific rules for things like generative AI. And then on the other side, you have the EU, who are laser focused on high-risk systems.
Oh, and high-risk AI, what does that even mean? We probably need a definition before we go any further.
Oh, for sure. High-risk AI systems are basically any AI systems that could potentially have a big impact, on people's lives, safety, fundamental rights. Think things like AI that's used in healthcare, finance, law enforcement.
Yeah, okay.
The EU's stance is basically that because those systems have such a high potential for harm, they need a whole other level of scrutiny and safeguards.
Makes sense. So it's not that all AI is bad or needs to be regulated to death.
Right.
But we need to be super careful with the stuff that has, a higher chance of going off the rails.
Exactly. And this report breaks down the whole concept of AI accountability into 5 main categories. We're going to focus on the first 3 today: data composition, regulatory cooperation, and risk and impact assessment.
All right, let's break those down one by one.
Yeah.
So data composition, I'm guessing that's all about the info that's used to train these AI systems, right?
You got it. It's like building a house, right? If you use crappy materials, the whole thing's going to fall apart. AI is the same way. If you train it on data that's biased, incomplete, whatever, you're going to end up with biased, unreliable results.
Garbage in, garbage out.
Right.
Even with all the fancy algorithms.
Exactly.
The report mentioned Brazil was taking a really strong stance on this.
They are. Brazil's actually mandating that any AI system operating in their country has to actively work to minimize bias in their data sets, which has huge EE implications for companies that are operating there. They can't just scrape some data off the internet and call it good.
Right.
They have to put in the work to make sure that data is representative and fair.
That sounds like, how do you even measure something like fairness in data?
It's the million-dollar question. There isn't really an easy answer, but I think the fact that Brazil's making this a legal requirement, it shows how serious they are about AI bias and its potential, for harm.
Yeah, no, that's a bold move. So Brazil's all about data quality. What about the EU? What's their approach?
The EU's got their own thing going on. They have these really specific rules around data quality, representativeness, and they even have this thing called geographical context for high-risk AI systems, that is.
Geographical context.
Yeah, they're basically recognizing that an AI system that's trained on data from one part of the world, it might not work well, or it could even be straight up harmful when you use it in a different place.
That makes sense. Like if you trained an AI to diagnose, skin cancer based on data from mostly people with lighter skin tones, it might not be as accurate for folks with darker skin.
Exactly. That's exactly the kind of thing they're trying to avoid. So the EU is pushing developers to think about these biases from the get-go, even down to where their data came from geographically.
Okay, so we got Brazil focused on minimizing bias. The EU's looking at data quality and context. What about China? What's their take on this whole data composition thing?
China's approach is a little different. Their rules are very much targeted towards specific types of AI.
Like what?
Well, generative AI is the big one, and then anything they're calling deep synthesis services.
So, deep fakes and stuff like that.
Yep, exactly. They're really concerned about making sure that any data used to train those systems is coming from legitimate sources, that it's not being used to spread misinformation or harm individuals.
So it's less about general bias and more about, malicious use of AI. What about the U.S.? Where do they land on all this?
The U.S. is a little bit of a mixed bag, honestly. They do have some voluntary guidelines around data composition, and they're encouraging government agencies to, think about the data issues when they're making any rules about AI. But it's not as comprehensive or legally binding as what we're seeing in other parts of the world.
So we're hey, you should probably think about this, but we're not going to make you do anything about it yet.
Pretty much. There's a lot of debate happening right now in the U.S. about how to balance, you know, encouraging innovation and regulating this stuff.
Okay, so we've covered data composition. That's like the foundation for responsible AI, it seems.
For sure.
But having good data is only part of it, right?
Right.
This whole regulatory cooperation thing, how governments and the people developing AI interact, that sounds like where things get really complicated.
Oh, yeah. It's basically a tug of war between oversight and innovation. Governments want to make sure AI is being developed responsibly, but they also don't want to kill progress, right?
Yeah, so how do they find that balance? How are they actually trying to, like, get a handle on all of this?
Well, the report highlights three main types of cooperation. We're talking data access, source code access, and then other forms of cooperation.
Okay, let's start with data access. What does that even look like in practice?
Basically, it's about whether or not governments can just demand to see the data that was used to train an AI system. Which, by the way, is a really controversial topic because it brings up all sorts of issues like privacy, trade secrets, intellectual property.
Yeah, I can see why companies might not be thrilled about just, like, handing over all their data to the government. What about source code access? That seems even more sensitive.
It is. Source code is basically the blueprint for an AI system, right? It's the code that makes the whole thing work. So giving the government access to that could let them understand how the AI is making decisions, but it could also give them access to like really valuable intellectual property that companies have spent years developing.
So who's asking for what? Give us the global tour of AI snooping.
Well, Argentina is definitely leading the charge. They want access to everything. Systems, source code, data, documentation, the whole 9 yards.
Wow, talk about transparency.
Right. But you can imagine that's not going over too well with companies. The EU's taking a bit more of a nuanced approach. They're saying, okay, data and source code access should be possible for high-risk AI, but only under very specific conditions and with strong safeguards to protect, like, all that intellectual property.
So it's not just a blanket, you have to share everything policy. What about China? I feel like they're all about control when it comes to AI.
China's got this system called algorithm filing. Basically, if you're developing AI that has the potential to impact society, you got to submit info about your algorithms to the government.
Interesting.
It's basically a way for them to keep tabs on what's being developed and, you know, potentially step in if they see something they don't like.
Yeah, that's pretty intense. And what about the U.S.? Are they asking for data or source code?
The U.S. is a little different. They're mostly focused on dual-use AI.
Dual use?
Yeah, stuff that can be used for both civilian and military purposes. And they're especially concerned about, like, risky transactions involving AI technology, especially when it comes to dealing with foreign countries.
So it's less about looking under the hood of every single AI system and more about making sure sensitive tech doesn't fall into the wrong hands.
Exactly. And it really reflects a theme we see a lot in the U.S.'s approach to regulating AI, which is, you know, trying to find a balance, trying to keep things secure without, like, totally crushing innovation.
Okay, so we've got data composition and regulatory cooperation, which are both fascinating and kind of a headache at the same time.
It's a lot.
There's one more thing we got to talk about before we wrap up for today, and that's risk and impact assessment.
Right. This is where we go from looking at what AI is made of to thinking about how it's actually going to act out in the real world. You know, how do we prepare for potential problems before they happen?
This is where it starts to get a little scary, isn't it?
It can be, yeah. But it's also super important. I mean, as AI gets more powerful, more integrated into our lives, the consequences, if things go wrong, those get a lot bigger too.
Yeah.
And this report actually gives us a really good look at how different countries are approaching that whole challenge.
Interesting.
Like some countries, for example, Brazil, they basically say, everyone developing AI, you got to do a risk assessment first. Then, if it's a high-risk system, you got to do an impact assessment on top of that.
But Brazil's like, better safe than sorry.
Pretty much. Canada, though, they flip that around. They use the impact assessment to figure out if the AI is high impact, and then they trigger a risk assessment.
So it's like, let's see how bad this could potentially get. And if it's really bad, then we'll dig deeper and see how likely it is to actually happen.
Exactly. It's a different way of, like, prioritizing resources, making sure you're focusing your attention on the areas where it matters most.
Okay, that's interesting. So we got Brazil with the risk first thing and Canada with the impact first thing. Are there any other, like, interesting examples from the report?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me was just how much the focus of these assessments varies. Like safety and security, obviously, that's a big one everywhere.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing a lot more emphasis on fundamental rights, especially in places like, Argentina, Brazil, and the EU.
When you say fundamental rights, what do you mean exactly?
Oh, things like the right to privacy, the right to not be discriminated against, right to a fair trial.
Yeah.
These are all rights that AI systems could potentially violate, whether they meant to or not.
So like an AI system used to screen job applicants could end up discriminating against, I don't know, people of a certain race or gender, even if the developers didn't mean for that to happen.
Exactly. Or an AI system that law enforcement uses to predict crime that could unfairly target certain neighborhoods. That's the kind of stuff that policymakers are really starting to wrestle with, especially as AI becomes more and more a part of our lives.
It's kind of mind-blowing and a little scary to think about all the ways AI could go wrong.
It is. And that's why this whole idea of risk and impact assessment is so important. If we can think about those problems ahead of time, we've got a better chance of stopping them from happening in the first place.
Okay, so we've identified some potential risks. We've done our assessments. What happens next? The report also talks about risk management and performance monitoring. What do those even mean in the world of AI?
Good question. Risk management is really all about the strategies you put in place to minimize those risks you've identified, to make them less likely to happen or less severe if they do.
So it's like having a fire escape plan.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You hope you never have to use it, but it's good to have just in case.
Right. And just like with fire safety, the things you actually do will depend on, what the risk is and how the AI is actually being used.
Exactly. And this report highlights some really interesting differences in how countries are approaching risk management. Like the EU and Canada, for example, they're a lot more prescriptive. They have specific steps that companies have to take to address risks.
So it's like a checklist. Make sure you do this, this, and this.
Basically, yeah. China, on the other hand, they focus more on setting up what they call security management systems for AI. They want companies to have strong processes in place to identify and respond to any security threats.
So it's less about rules and more about building a culture of security.
Right. And that really shows you a difference in how people think about regulation. Some want more rules, others want more principles.
Interesting. So there's no right answer when it comes to risk management. Just depends on the situation.
Pretty much, yeah. It all comes down to the context and what the specific risks are.
Okay, what about performance monitoring? How do we even know if an AI is behaving how it's supposed to once it's out in the real world?
That's where performance monitoring comes in. It's all about keeping an eye on things even after you've deployed the AI, collecting data on how it's performing and looking for any signs of, weird or harmful stuff.
So it's like having a babysitter for your AI, making sure it doesn't get into trouble.
I like that analogy. And just like babysitting, how closely you watch depends on how mature the AI is and how risky it could be. If it's just a simple chatbot, you might not need to watch it that closely. But if it's controlling something like, I don't know, a power grid,
Yeah.
then you need to be way more vigilant.
So what are the big challenges when it comes to performance monitoring?
Honestly, the sheer complexity of these AI systems, it's tough to really grasp how they're making decisions, let alone predict how they'll react in new situations. And on top of that, you need to be collecting data and analyzing it constantly. It's not a one-time thing.
It's a process.
Exactly. And this report actually shows how differently countries are tackling this challenge. Like the EU, they're going all in on continuous monitoring for any high-risk AI.
So they're really taking charge there.
Yeah, they're basically saying these high-risk systems, they need to be watched 24/7 to make sure they're not causing any harm.
Which makes sense, given all the potential consequences.
Yeah.
What about the U.S.? Are they on the continuous monitoring train?
Not really. They're more about voluntary guidelines and best practices right now. They're encouraging companies to build robust monitoring systems, but they're not making it a rule.
So it's more of a trust but verify approach.
Yeah, you could say that. And again, it shows that whole debate in the U.S. How much should the government get involved in regulating AI? Some folks say too much regulation will stifle innovation. Others say we need stronger safeguards to protect people from potential harm.
All right, well, I think that's a good place to stop for today.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground. Data composition, regulatory cooperation, all these different ways countries are thinking about risk assessment, risk management, and performance monitoring.
Yeah. It's a lot to take in.
It's a lot, but I think the big takeaway is that AI accountability is a global issue, right?
It really is.
But there's no one-size-fits-all solution. Different countries are tackling this thing in different ways depending on their values, their priorities, where they are technology-wise.
Absolutely. And it's an area that's constantly changing as AI itself keeps getting more advanced.
So folks, stay tuned. We'll be back next time to dig even deeper into this world of risk and impact assessment. And in the meantime, maybe start thinking about what kind of world you want to live in with all this AI stuff happening. Do we want a world where the government controls everything, or a world where we prioritize moving fast and breaking things, even if it means more risk? There's a lot to think about, and we'll keep exploring it in our next deep dive. Welcome back to our deep dive on AI accountability. Last time we were talking about how governments are trying to find that sweet spot, right? Between keeping AI in check and, like, not stifling innovation. It's tricky.
Yeah, for sure. And that tension really comes to a head when we look at risk and impact assessments for AI.
Right, we were just getting to that. It's all about trying to figure out what could go wrong with these systems before they're, like, let loose in the world. And then, how bad could it actually get?
Exactly. It's about thinking ahead, trying to anticipate those harms, and put things in place to, like, minimize them. Because, we're seeing it more and more. AI is making decisions that have real-world consequences, whether it's healthcare, finance, transportation, even criminal justice.
So it's not just some abstract debate about AI ethics. It's about making sure these systems are safe and reliable. For real.
Exactly. And that's what I think is so cool about this report. It shows you how different countries are actually wrestling with this stuff. Like, you look at Brazil, they're basically saying, everyone developing AI, you got to do a risk assessment first,
right,
no matter what.
Uh-huh.
And then, if it's a high-risk system, you got to do an impact assessment, too.
So Brazil's definitely taking the better safe than sorry approach.
I think so. They're not taking any chances. Canada, though, they do things a little differently. They use the impact assessment to see if it's high impact, and then they trigger the risk assessment.
So it's kind of like, let's see how bad this could be first. If it's really bad, then we'll look closer and see how likely it is to actually happen.
Exactly. It's about being smart with your resources, focusing on the areas that could have the biggest impact.
Okay, so we've got risk first in Brazil, impact first in Canada. What about everyone else? Anything else that stood out in the report?
Well, one thing that caught my eye was that the focus of these assessments can be so different. Safety and security, that's obviously a big concern everywhere.
Yeah.
But we're also seeing more and more emphasis on fundamental rights, especially in places like Argentina, Brazil, the EU.
What do you mean by fundamental rights?
I'm talking things like the right to privacy, the right not to be discriminated against, the right to a fair trial. These are all things that AI systems could potentially mess with, even if it's not on purpose.
So, like, let's say you're using an AI to screen job applicants. It could end up discriminating against, I don't know, women or minorities, even if the people who made it didn't want that to happen.
Exactly. Or what if law enforcement's using AI to predict crime? It could end up targeting certain neighborhoods unfairly. These are the kinds of questions that are keeping policymakers up at night, especially as AI gets more and more powerful.
It's kind of wild to think about all the ways this could go sideways.
It is. But that's exactly why risk and impact assessments are so crucial. If you can think about those problems ahead of time, you have a much better chance of preventing them.
Okay, so let's say we've identified some potential risks. We've done our assessments. What happens next?
Yeah.
The report also talks about risk management and performance monitoring. What do those even mean in the world of AI?
So risk management, it's basically about coming up with strategies, right, to minimize the chances of those risks actually happening. Or if they do happen, make the impact less severe.
So kind of like having a fire escape plan.
Exactly. You might never need to use it, but it's good to have one just in case.
Right. And I guess just like with fire safety, what you actually do will depend on, what kind of fire it could be and where the fire escape is. It's all about context.
You got it. And the report shows some pretty interesting differences in how countries are thinking about this risk management thing. Like the EU and Canada, they're way more prescriptive. They're all about laying down the law, telling companies, you got to do this, this, and this.
So it's like a checklist. Don't forget to do step 1, step 2, step 3.
Yep, pretty much. But then you have China. They're much more focused on setting up what they call security management systems for AI. They want companies to have systems in place to catch security threats and respond to them.
So it's less about following a set of rules and more about, like, creating a culture of security within companies.
Exactly. And that really gets at the heart of the different philosophies around regulation. Some folks want strict rules, others want guiding principles.
Interesting. So there's no one right way to do risk management. It just depends.
Yep. It all comes down to the context. What are the specific risks? What's the situation? It's not one size fits all.
Right. What about performance monitoring?
Hmm?
How do we make sure AI systems are behaving themselves once they're out in the real world?
That's where performance monitoring comes in. It's all about keeping tabs on how the AI is doing, even after it's been released. Collecting data, analyzing it, looking for any signs that it's doing something funky, something it's not supposed to.
So it's like AI babysitting, making sure it doesn't get into too much trouble.
Huh, I like that. And just like with babysitting, how closely you watch depends on how mature the AI is, right? And how much potential there is for things to go wrong. If it's just a simple chatbot, maybe you don't need to watch it that closely. But if it's controlling, I don't know, air traffic.
Yeah, the stakes are a little higher.
Exactly. So the level of monitoring needs to match that.
What are some of the biggest challenges when it comes to performance monitoring, though?
Honestly, I think it's just the sheer complexity of AI. It's
Yeah.
really hard to wrap your head around how these systems are actually making decisions, let alone try to predict how they'll react in new situations.
Well,
And on top of that, you've got to be collecting data, analyzing it. It's a constant
it's
process.
not a set it and forget it's kind of thing.
Definitely not. And again, we see some interesting variations in how countries are handling this. Like the EU, they're all about continuous monitoring for any high-risk AI.
So they're not messing around.
Nope. They're basically saying these high-risk systems, they need to be under constant surveillance to make sure they're not causing any harm.
Which, I mean, makes sense when you think about it. What about the U.S.? Are they requiring continuous monitoring too?
Not at the moment. They're more into voluntary guidelines and best practices for now. They're encouraging companies to build good monitoring systems, but it's not a requirement yet.
So more of a trust but verify situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And it reflects this ongoing debate in the US, right? How much should the government actually be involved in regulating AI? Some folks are saying too much regulation and you'll kill innovation. Others are saying we need stronger rules to keep people safe. It's a tough balance.
It really is. All right, well, I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've talked about risk assessment, risk management, performance monitoring, all these moving parts of the AI accountability puzzle.
Yeah.
And, we've seen how differently countries are tackling this stuff. It's a global issue,
Yeah.
but there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely. It really depends on a country's values, their priorities, how advanced their tech is. And it's something that's constantly evolving right alongside AI itself.
For sure. Well, we'll be back next time to explore some potential solutions to all of this, as well as, what we can do as individuals to push for responsible AI. Stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into AI accountability. We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? It's a complex world out there, all these different approaches to keeping AI in check.
It is. It's a lot for companies to keep track of. Trying to develop AI when the rules are different everywhere, it's like a constantly shifting maze.
Yeah, no kidding. So where do we go from here? Is there any way to, bring some order to all of this?
Well, maybe chaos is a bit dramatic, but it's definitely complicated, and it's always changing. But there are some things happening that could help, make things a little more consistent.
Okay, I'm listening. What can we do about all this regulatory fragmentation? It just seems like a headache for everyone.
One thing is to focus on developing, international standards, guidelines for responsible AI. Organizations like the OECD and the IE, they're already on it, bringing experts together to try and find some common ground.
That makes sense. If everyone can agree on some basic principles, it would make things easier for companies, right? They wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel every time they go to a new market.
Exactly. It's like having a universal travel adapter. You don't need a different one for every country.
I like that analogy.
Of course, there will always be some differences in how countries implement those standards, just like there are still different electrical systems around the world. But having that shared framework, it would help prevent the worst harms, and it would make things fairer for businesses.
So it's finding that balance between global standards and letting countries adapt things to their own needs.
Yeah, it's a delicate dance, and it takes everyone working together. Governments, industry, the public.
Speaking of the public, I've been wondering about that. What role do regular people even play in all this? It's not like we can rewrite laws or, force companies to change.
That's true, but we actually have more power than we might think. We're all AI consumers, whether we realize it or not. And as consumers, we have choices.
You mean choosing to use products from companies that are known for being ethical with AI?
Exactly. We can vote with our wallets, support companies that align with our values, and we can speak up. demand more transparency, more accountability from the companies that are developing this stuff.
So we can ask questions, raise concerns, hold their feet to the fire a little.
Absolutely. And we can support the organizations that are fighting for responsible AI. There are tons of groups out there doing amazing work, pushing for policies that protect people and promote ethical AI.
So it's not just about what's happening at the government level or in these big tech companies. It's about what we do as individuals. Our choices actually matter.
They really do. And when we all act together, we can create real change. The future of AI, it's not something that's just happening to us. We're all shaping it together.
Well said. This has been a really fascinating deep dive. It's a complex issue, no doubt, but it's so important, especially as AI keeps becoming more and more a part of our lives.
Couldn't agree more. And it's a conversation we need to keep having. Keep asking those tough questions, looking at things from all sides, and working towards solutions that make sure AI is a force for good in the world, for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive for today. Make sure to check out the full report and that Claire K platform. The links are in the show notes. And until next time, keep thinking critically about AI and how it's shaping your world. Thanks for joining us.